Dallas, Texas. The city carried a rhythm all its own, a rhythm made up of car horns echoing through downtown streets, neon lights burning along the boulevards, and the thick, muggy air of a southern summer night. Scattered across the city were bars filled with men who had just clocked out, still carrying the weight of the day's violence, blood, and lies on their shoulders. Among them, that night, was a face well known to both colleagues and neighbors, Detective Mark Reynolds. He was 38 years old, a veteran with 15 years on the Dallas force. And if you asked anyone who worked with him, they'd give you the same kind of description: tough as nails, conservative, a man who doesn't bend. Mark wasn't the kind of cop people thought of as warm or approachable. He didn't joke around in the bullpen or share beers with rookies after a shift. He was rigid, almost self-righteous, the guy who quoted the rulebook word for word. On paper, he was ideal. Never took a bribe, never let a big case slip through his fingers. To the press, he was the Iron Detective. But what the headlines didn't show was that Mark was a man cracking quietly at the edges. Behind that reputation was someone exhausted. His body carried the signs of years without sleep, 12-hour shifts stacked one after the other, and too many late nights numbing himself with whiskey. His wife had left him nearly 5 years ago, taking their young son with her. Since then, Mark had lived in a half-empty apartment with little more than a worn-out sofa and a television that stayed on long after he passed out. He could bark down a suspect in an interrogation room, but when he was alone, he was just a middle-aged man drowning in silence. That night, like so many before, Mark slid onto a bar stool at a familiar dive. The amber light cast hard shadows over his face, highlighting the deep lines near his eyes. The first shot of whiskey hit like medicine, burning down his throat but soothing the knots in his chest. The second made him looser. The third cracked open the doors he usually kept locked. In those moments, he wasn't Detective Reynolds, the man colleagues respected and criminals feared. He was simply Mark, lonely, bitter, and looking for something, anything to fill the hole inside him. The music pounded in the background. Young men and women laughed, their voices overlapping in bursts of joy he could no longer relate to. He wasn't part of their world anymore, if he ever was. But he wasn't ready to go back to the empty silence of his apartment, either. That was when a thought hit him, one he would have scoffed at in the sober light of day. Call someone. Not a friend, not a colleague, a girl. He'd seen plenty of officers crash and burn for the same thing. Guys caught with escorts, guys exposed in scandals. He'd been the one to sneer at them, to say they deserved it. Yet there he was, scrolling through his phone, pulling up a number he'd heard whispered about in the locker room. A discreet service. No names, no strings. A call made in the haze of whiskey. A decision he told himself he could bury forever. That was the contradiction that defined Mark Reynolds. By day, he was the law, stern, disciplined, untouchable. By night, he was fractured, lonely, and afraid of being seen for what he really was. The whiskey didn't erase that fear. It only dulled it long enough to make a mistake. And mistakes have a way of multiplying. By the time he stumbled out of the bar, the city's heat pressed against him like a second skin. His phone buzzed with a text confirmation. Sierra will meet you at the hotel in 20 minutes. He lifted his head toward the dark sky, his heart thudding with a mix of excitement and shame. Somewhere deep down, he knew he was crossing a line he couldn't uncross. He didn't know it yet, but the name Sierra would soon mean something more than a late-night escape. It would become the center of a storm that would destroy his career, his freedom, and everything he thought he had under control. What started as a secret, a night he swore no one would ever know was about to turn into one of the most shocking cases Dallas had ever seen. And at the center of it all was the man who wore the badge, Mark Reynolds, protector of justice, about to become its greatest betrayer. The hotel lobby smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and stale perfume, the kind of scent that clung to places that lived more at night than in the day. Mark moved through it with his head down, hoping no one would look too closely at the man in a wrinkled shirt, his badge tucked deep into his pocket. He had chosen this place for a reason: discreet, mid-range, a spot where people came and went without asking questions. The kind of hotel that ran on secrets. Upstairs, the room key clicked and he pushed open the door. The lights were dim, curtains already drawn, the bed made with military precision. Mark sat on the edge of the mattress, his head in his hands. For a moment, he thought about leaving. He could walk out right now, go home, pretend a call had never been made. No one had to know. But then his phone buzzed again. On my way. Sierra. Minutes later, a knock rattled the door. He froze. His heart kicked in his chest, harder than it had during any raid or foot chase in his career. Slowly, he got up and opened it. She stood there, framed in the hallway light. Sierra. Tall, young, and striking in a way that turned heads without effort. Her hair fell in glossy waves, her dress clung in all the ways it was meant to. And when she smiled, it was practiced but warm, the kind of smile that suggested intimacy could be bought and sold. "Your Mark?" she asked softly, her voice smooth. He nodded, stepping aside to let her in. She glided past him, the faint smell of floral perfume trailing in the air. For a second, Mark just stood there, watching her, trying to reconcile the decision he had made. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. But now it was real, and the only way forward was through it. Sierra slipped off her heels and set them neatly by the door, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before, which, Mark thought bitterly, she probably had. She turned to him, tilting her head. "Rough day." He almost laughed. If only she knew. 15 years of rough days piled on his back like bricks. Instead, he just muttered something like that and reached for the minibar bottle of whiskey he'd bought on the way in. He poured himself a drink, then another for her. They talked in the shallow way strangers talk when they know this night will end and they'll never speak again. Sierra had an ease about her, a lightness that filled the silence Mark, usually drowned with alcohol. She laughed at his dry humor, touched his arm when she spoke. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him like that, like he mattered, even if only for an hour. But beneath the charm, there was something else, the gnawing guilt. He kept seeing his own reflection in the darkened window, the shape of a cop who swore he'd never be this man. Every laugh, every brush of her hand reminded him of how far he was stepping out of line. Still, the warmth of her presence dulled that voice in his head, just as surely as the whiskey dulled the knot in his chest. As the minutes slipped by, the boundaries blurred. Sierra leaned in closer, her perfume mixing with the sharp scent of liquor. Her hand found his shoulder, then his jaw. For the first time in years, Mark let himself be touched without pulling away, without the armor of duty between him and the world. He thought it would be simple. A transaction, something that began and ended in this hotel room, forgotten as soon as the door closed behind him. But as the intimacy grew, as clothes began to fall away, Mark's fragile illusion cracked. In a flash, everything shifted. It wasn't what he expected. It wasn't what he told himself it would be. In one disorienting moment, he realized Sierra wasn't the kind of woman he had thought she was. His pulse thundered in his ears. The room spun, not from whiskey, but from a cocktail of shock, shame, and something darker he couldn't name. He pulled back abruptly, his face tightening. Sierra's smile faltered. She opened her mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to soothe, but the words never landed. Mark was already on his feet, pacing the room, hands trembling. "What the hell is this?" he hissed, though the answer was clear in front of him. Her eyes widened, then softened. "I should have told you sooner," she began carefully, her voice edged with both fear and sincerity. "I didn't mean to," but he didn't let her finish. He couldn't. In his head, the storm had already begun. Years of pride, of reputation, of the badge he wore like a second skin. All of it felt threatened in this single moment. If anyone knew, if anyone ever found out, Sierra reached for him, desperate to calm him down, but the touch only fueled the fire roaring inside. To Mark, it wasn't comfort. It was betrayal. It was humiliation. And as the silence thickened in that dim hotel room, one thing became clear. This night was no longer just a secret. It was a fuse, lit and burning fast, with no way for either of them to stop what was coming next. Mark's breath came hard and uneven, as if every inhale scraped against his ribs. The room that had once felt dim and safe now seemed claustrophobic, every shadow sharpened, every sound amplified. He could hear the hum of the air conditioner, the faint buzz of the neon sign outside the window, and underneath it all, the pounding of his own heart. Sierra stood a few feet away, her hands slightly raised, palms open, as if showing she meant no harm. "Mark, please," she began, her voice trembling yet soft. "Don't," he snapped, his voice cracking. "Don't you say my name like you know me." Sierra's lips quivered, but she kept her composure. She'd been in dangerous situations before, drunk clients, violent Johns, men who thought paying for an hour gave them a license to do anything they wanted. But this was different. There was something about the way this man's eyes darted around, the way his hands clenched and unclenched, that told her he was not simply angry. He was unraveling. "I didn't mean to deceive you," she said quietly, trying to steady her breathing. "I thought maybe you'd accept me. People usually don't ask." "Accept you?" Mark barked out a laugh that sounded more like a growl. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you have any idea what happens if someone finds out I was in this room with you?" His words were sharp, but beneath them lay something even stronger: fear. It surged through him, mixing with the whiskey in his veins. He saw flashes of headlines: "Detective caught in hotel scandal." He imagined the smirks of his fellow officers, the pity in his captain's eyes, his ex-wife using it as ammunition to keep his son away forever. Everything he had built, every ounce of respect, gone in a heartbeat. Sierra took a careful step forward, her voice gentler now. "No one has to know. I swear. This doesn't leave this room." But Mark couldn't hear reason anymore. Her words only fanned the flames of paranoia. "This doesn't leave this room." How many times had suspects promised the same before turning on him? How many times had he been burned by trusting someone's word? His jaw clenched so hard it ached. "You think I could just forget this? Pretend it didn't happen?" "Yes," Sierra said quickly, desperation creeping into her tone. "Yes, exactly. This never happened. Please, Mark, you don't want to do anything you'll regret." Her plea landed heavy, but instead of softening him, it hardened something inside. The idea that she held the power to destroy him, even if she promised not to use it, was intolerable. He was a cop. He was supposed to be the one in control. And yet, standing here, half drunk and humiliated, he felt powerless. He shook his head, pacing again, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand. You'll tell someone. You'll slip up, and then it's all over." Sierra's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move. She knew sudden motions could provoke men like him. "I wouldn't. I swear on my life I wouldn't." Her words echoed in the silence, and for a split second, Mark almost believed her. Almost. But then another thought shot through his mind like lightning. If she swore on her life? What if that was the only guarantee? The idea rooted itself quickly, too quickly. He tried to shake it, but the seed had been planted. His chest heaved as the alcohol blurred the line between thought and impulse. Sierra must have sensed it. She inched backward, her eyes darting toward the door. "I can leave," she whispered. "You'll never see me again. I'll disappear right now." But to Mark, that door wasn't an escape for her. It was a threat to him. Once she walked out, he couldn't control what happened next. He caught a glimpse of Sierra's wide eyes, reflecting his own terror back at him, like a mirror showing him everything he refused to admit. He moved toward her, slow at first, then faster. She raised her hands higher, her voice breaking. "Mark, please don't. I'm not your enemy. I'm not." "Shut up," he roared, the sound raw and animalistic. The space between them closed, and in that instant Sierra's fear turned into panic. She reached out, maybe to push him back, maybe to steady herself, but the contact was the spark to the powder keg. Mark grabbed her wrists, shoving her against the wall. The impact rattled the cheap picture frame that hung there, the glass trembling in its frame. Her eyes locked onto his, wide and pleading. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "Please, you don't." And for a fraction of a second, he hesitated. He saw not a threat, not a secret that could ruin him, but a human being terrified and vulnerable. His grip loosened ever so slightly, then tightened again as the wave of rage and fear surged back, stronger than before. His voice dropped to a whisper, harsh and final. I can't take that chance." The words hung heavy in the air, sealing Sierra's fate. The night had started as an escape, a fleeting attempt to drown his loneliness. But now, it teetered on the edge of violence, with no way to step back. The hotel room seemed to shrink around them, the hum of the air conditioner drowned out by the sound of two lives colliding. One fighting desperately to live, the other consumed by the terror of losing everything. What happened next would not just end a night. It would end a life, and it would change another forever. Mark's hands shook as they pressed against Sierra's wrists, the force of his grip leaving red marks that deepened with every passing second. The dim light of the hotel room cast long, jagged shadows across the wall, making the space feel like a cage. He wasn't a cop anymore, not in this moment. He wasn't the law, the protector, or the man who preached about order and morality. He was just a terrified human being, cornered by his own shame and rage. "Let me go," Sierra pleaded, her voice cracking as she tried to wrench free. Tears welled in her eyes, streaking her makeup. Her body trembled, but she wasn't just fighting him. She was fighting for her life. Mark felt her words like needles piercing his skin, each one reminding him of the reality he couldn't bear. She had power over him. Power to speak, power to reveal, power to destroy everything he thought he had secured. And in his fractured state of mind, there was only one way to silence that power. "I can't," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. "I can't risk it." Sierra shook her head frantically. "No one will know. I swear. Please, Mark, you don't have to do this." Her desperation cracked something deep inside him, but instead of loosening his grip, it fueled the storm that had taken hold of him. He thought of his captain, the men at the precinct, the smirks that would spread if this secret got out. He thought of his son, already distant, already half lost to him. What would it mean if his boy grew up hearing whispers about what his father had done in some hotel room? The images blurred together until they were unbearable, and before Mark fully realized it, his hands slid from her wrists to her throat. The shock in Sierra's eyes was immediate, raw. Her lips parted, forming words that never fully came out. She clawed at his arms, nails digging into his skin, leaving scratches that stung. The sound that escaped her throat wasn't a scream. It was a choked gasp, guttural and broken. Mark's face twisted, his teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. He told himself it was survival. He told himself she had left him no choice. But beneath every rationalization, he knew the truth. This was murder. The room filled with the sounds of struggle. Furniture scraping against the floor, the dull thud of Sierra's heels kicking against the bed frame, the desperate wheeze of air being stolen from her lungs. Her hands beat against his chest, weaker with every strike, until finally they fell to her sides, limp and unmoving. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Mark froze, his hands still locked around her neck, even after her body went slack. His heart hammered against his ribs, sweat dripping down his temples, breath ragged and shallow. He stared at her face, once vibrant, now pale and lifeless, her eyes wide open but empty. It hit him like a tidal wave. He had crossed the line. There was no going back. Stumbling backward, he released her and watched her body crumple onto the bed, twisted and still. He staggered, clutching his head, muttering under his breath, "Oh God, oh God, what did I do?" The weight of his actions pressed down on him with brutal clarity. He had killed her, not in a scuffle, not in defense, but in cold panic. He had stolen a life to protect a reputation. The badge in his pocket suddenly felt like a curse, a symbol of everything he had betrayed. Mark paced the room like a caged animal, his mind racing. He thought about calling someone, maybe even turning himself in, but the thought died as soon as it surfaced. He imagined the headlines again, the courtroom, the life sentence. His fear twisted into calculation. He moved to the minibar, grabbing empty bottles and scattering them near the bed. He pulled a prescription bottle from Sierra's purse, shaking out the pills and spreading them across the nightstand. But in his drunken panic, he never thought to hide the dark bruises rising on her throat. To any coroner, they would scream the truth. This was no overdose. He adjusted her body, laying her flat, tucking the blanket halfway up her chest, as if she'd simply passed out after too much partying. But even as he staged the scene, he knew it wasn't perfect. He saw the bruises forming on her neck, the angry red marks from his hands. He considered covering them with makeup, but the thought seemed absurd. He yanked the curtains tighter, dimming the room further, hoping it would be enough. When he finally stepped back, his stomach churned. It looked sloppy, desperate. But he was out of time, out of options. He grabbed his jacket, stuffed the half-empty whiskey bottle into his bag, and wiped the doorknob with the sleeve. At the threshold, he paused and turned back. Sierra's face stared blankly at the ceiling, frozen in a silence that screamed louder than anything he'd ever heard. He whispered, almost like a prayer, "I didn't have a choice." But deep down, he knew that was a lie. Mark slipped into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind him. The carpet muffled his footsteps as he made his way toward the side exit, avoiding the main lobby. He kept his head low, but every camera mounted on the ceiling seemed to burn into him. He pulled his cap lower, adjusted his collar, and walked faster. The night air hit him like a slap when he finally stepped outside. It should have sobered him, but instead it only deepened the pit in his stomach. He glanced around the parking lot, half expecting someone to point a finger, to shout his name, to drag him back inside. But no one came. The world carried on, unaware of the life he had just ended. Sliding into his car, he gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. He sat there for a long moment, staring through the windshield, listening to the faint buzz of the hotel sign glowing red against the night sky. His mind replayed every second, the look in Sierra's eyes, the sound of her gasps, the final silence. Mark told himself again that it was necessary, that it was survival. But no amount of repetition could erase the truth now seared into his conscience. He hadn't just killed Sierra. He had killed himself, the man he once was, the cop he pretended to be. When he finally turned the key in the ignition, the engine roared to life, masking the tremor in his hands. He pulled out of the lot, disappearing into the night. But no matter how far he drove, no matter how many streets separated him from that hotel room, he couldn't escape the one truth that would haunt him forever. Sierra was dead, and her ghost was already following him. Mark drove aimlessly for almost an hour, the city lights blurring into streaks through his windshield. Every red light felt like an eternity, every passing siren like a warning meant only for him. His palms slicked the steering wheel with sweat. He kept telling himself he had done what he had to do, that no one would ever know. But in the pit of his stomach, he knew he'd left a mess behind. By the time he pulled into his apartment complex, the clock on the dashboard read past 3 a.m. He sat in the car for a long while, staring at the faint glow of his building's windows. Inside that apartment, there was nothing waiting for him but silence. He had always thought silence was better than chaos, but tonight, it promised to swallow him whole. When he finally forced himself upstairs, he tossed his jacket on the couch and went straight to the bathroom mirror. His reflection stared back, pale and hollow-eyed, scratches visible on his forearms where Sierra had clawed at him. He rubbed at them furiously, but the marks remained angry and undeniable. He splashed water on his face, whispering to his reflection, "It's fine. It looks like nothing. Just scratches. You were drunk. You fell." He repeated it until it almost sounded like truth. Mark knew the basics of staging a scene. He had seen enough overdoses in cheap motels to know what investigators expected. But when he pictured Sierra's bruised throat, a cold dread settled over him. That wasn't going to pass as an overdose. Any decent coroner would see it for what it was. Still, he clung to the idea that he had left enough doubt. Pills scattered on the nightstand. Whiskey bottles on the floor. Curtains drawn tight. Maybe they'd call it a tragic accident, chalk it up to another young woman lost to bad choices. He told himself that over and over, yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw the camera in the hallway blinking red. The cameras. He had been so careful leaving through the side exit, but he knew hotels like that didn't miss a trick. There would be footage, maybe grainy, maybe without sound, but enough. His badge had gotten him into crime scenes, into interrogation rooms. He knew exactly what detectives would do when they pulled that video. By sunrise, Mark had already run through a dozen scenarios in his head. None of them ended well. The best he could hope for was delay. If he kept calm, if he acted normal, maybe he could stay ahead of the suspicion. Maybe. The day dragged on like molasses. He went into work because staying home would look worse. He drank bitter coffee and forced his voice steady when he greeted his captain. Every time a phone rang in the bullpen, he felt his stomach twist, half expecting it to be for him. He caught himself staring too long at the news alerts on his phone, waiting for Sierra's name to appear in black and white. By early afternoon, it did. Young woman found dead in downtown hotel. The article was short, vague, but the words made his throat dry. Cause of death undetermined. Police investigating. Mark felt the walls of the station closing in. He excused himself, claiming a headache, and left early. Back in his apartment, he pulled the blinds shut and poured himself another drink. He paced the living room, replaying every detail. The way her body had slumped, the pills he'd scattered, the scratches on his arms, the camera in the hallway, the text on his phone confirming her arrival. That last one hit him hardest. His phone. He snatched it from the counter, scrolling through the messages. There it was, Sierra will meet you at the hotel in 20 minutes. His throat tightened. If the investigation reached the service she worked for, if they pulled her phone records, it would lead straight to him. He deleted the thread, every last word, but it felt like ripping out weeds while leaving the roots. He knew better. Everything lived somewhere, in a server in a log. Nothing was ever truly gone. That night, he barely slept. Every creak in the hallway outside his apartment made him sit up, waiting for a knock on the door. Every shadow on the wall felt like a figure coming closer. By the time dawn broke again, he looked more like a suspect than a detective, hollow-eyed, jittery, sweating through his shirt. And then it happened. The news shifted. The next morning's headline read, "Authorities suspect foul play in hotel death." The article cited inconsistencies at the scene and bruising that suggested strangulation. It was only a matter of time before they dug deeper. Mark stood in his kitchen, staring at the words on his phone screen, his heart hammering. He thought about running, driving until the road ended, disappearing somewhere no one would find him. But that wasn't who he was. Or at least, that wasn't who he had always been. He was a cop. He belonged to Dallas. And Dallas would come for him. By the end of the week, he heard whispers at the station. A homicide detective in another division had mentioned the case. Someone had seen the camera footage, blurry, yes, but clear enough to identify a man of his build, his height. Rumors spread fast in places like this. Colleagues stopped looking him in the eye. Conversations fell silent when he walked into the room. Mark tried to act unfazed, but inside, panic gnawed at him like acid. His cover story was unraveling, thread by thread. He told himself he could outlast it, that the case would go cold, that they wouldn't push hard because Sierra was just another sex worker, forgotten by most. But deep down, he knew better. He had worked too many cases to believe in luck. Forensic science didn't miss things like bruises around neck. Detectives didn't ignore cameras or phone records. And so he poured another drink, telling himself it wasn't over yet, telling himself he still had a chance. But the truth was clear, even if he couldn't say it aloud. His secrets had already slipped from that hotel room, and it was only a matter of time before they came pounding at his door. The knock came 3 days later. It wasn't loud, not the kind of pounding Mark always associated with warrants or raids. It was calm, measured, 2 raps, a pause, then 2 more. Still, the sound made his blood run cold. He already knew who it was before he opened the door. Detectives stood in the hallway. He recognized them instantly. Colleagues from the homicide division, Detective Alvarez and her partner, Detective Jennings. Both wore the same expression, a mix of politeness and suspicion. Alvarez was the one who spoke first. "Morning, Reynolds. Mind if we come in?" Mark forced a nod, stepping aside. His apartment suddenly felt smaller with them inside, their eyes scanning everything, soaking in the details the way cops always did. They didn't sit. They stood, waiting for him to crack first. Jennings got to the point. "We're looking into the death of a woman named Sierra. You probably saw it in the news. Hotel off Elm Street." Mark's throat tightened, but he kept his tone neutral. "Yeah, I saw it. Tragic. Alvarez's eyes flicked over him, sharp as a blade. You wouldn't happen to know her, would you? It wasn't really a question. It was bait. Mark had used the same tactic himself countless times. He shook his head, forcing his face blank. No. What? Jennings pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open. Well, we've got security footage. Shows a man leaving the hotel around the same time she was last seen alive. Granny sure, but the bill, the walk, it looks a lot like you. Mark's stomach lurched. He fought to keep his face calm, his voice steady. A lot of guys in Dallas look like me. You know that. True, Alvarez said smoothly. But here's the thing. The hotel also keeps logs of who uses their side entrances. Key cards, cameras. We're going to subpoena those. If you were there, Reynolds, it's better to be upfront about it now. The silence stretched. Mark could feel their eyes boring into him, searching for cracks. He swallowed hard, then shook his head again. I wasn't there. The detectives exchanged a glance. Jennings closed his notebook with a snap. All right, we just wanted to give you the chance to clear it up. He tucked the notebook into his jacket. We'll be in touch. When they left, Mark collapsed onto the couch, sweat beading at his temples. His own colleagues, people he'd once shared beers and cases with, were circling him like vultures. They knew. Maybe they couldn't prove it yet, but they knew. That night, Mark sat in the dark, the TV flickering on mute. His mind ran through possibilities. Wipe his phone clean, get rid of clothes, leave town. But every plan felt half-baked, doomed before it began. They had the footage. They'd find the text messages. They'd talk to the service Sierra worked for. The noose was tightening, thread by thread. And then came the call. Reynolds, Captain wants you in his office. Now. His heart sank. At the precinct, whispers trailed behind him like shadows. He pushed through them, face set, jaw locked, and walked into the captain's office. The man didn't bother with small talk. Mark, sit. He sat. You know why you're here. The captain leaned forward, his hands clasped. Internal Affairs is looking into you. You were seen leaving that hotel. I don't want to believe it, but this looks bad. Mark opened his mouth, but the captain cut him off. Don't. I've been doing this too long. If you're clean, fine, prove it. But if you're not, you better get a lawyer because this thing is about to blow wide open. Suspension came down the next day. Badge, gun, gone. Just like that. Mark walked out of the precinct he'd called home for 15 years, his co-workers staring, some with pity, most with judgment. He could feel the gossip swirling. The fall of a cop was always blood in the water. At home, he tore open another bottle of whiskey, draining it until the edges of his panic dulled. But even drunk, the fear clawed at him. He kept seeing Sierra's face, kept hearing her choked gasp. In the dead of night, he thought he heard her voice whispering from the corners of the room. The investigation moved fast. Forensics confirmed strangulation, not overdose. Toxicology came back negative. No drugs in Sierra's system that could explain her death. The case had shifted officially to homicide. Detective Alvarez called him in for questioning. Not as a colleague this time, but as a suspect. You were at that hotel, she said, her voice low, steady. We've got you on camera. You can keep denying it, but the truth always comes out. Why don't you tell me what really happened? Mark stared across the table, jaw clenched, sweat trickling down his back. He wanted to shout, to flip the table, to do anything but sit there under her gaze. But he said nothing. He just stared, like silence could save him. Alvarez leaned closer. She was 25, Reynolds. She had a name, a family, a life. And now she's dead. We're going to get justice for her, with or without your help. Mark said nothing. By the end of the session, it was clear they had enough to keep building the case. His silence hadn't protected him. It had only sealed his role as their prime suspect. That night, Mark sat in his apartment, surrounded by empty bottles, staring at his badge on the coffee table. It looked foreign now, a piece of metal that no longer belonged to him. He picked it up, turned in his hand, and whispered to the empty room, I was supposed to be better than this. But there was no one left to hear him. No partner, no wife, no son. Only the memory of Sierra and the investigation closing in tighter with every passing day. The courthouse steps were swarmed with cameras. Reporters jostled for position. Microphones stretched like spears toward anyone even remotely connected to the case. The death of Sierra once just another anonymous tragedy in a city teeming with them, had become a national firestorm. The headline practically wrote itself: Veteran cop accused of killing transgender sex worker. When Mark Reynolds was led up the steps in handcuffs, the crowd erupted. Some shouted his name, demanding justice, calling him a monster. Others, holding signs that read, "He was deceived," and "Protect our cops," yelled back at the protesters, insisting he was the victim of a cruel trick. The two sides screamed at each other, separated only by a flimsy row of metal barricades and a few overworked deputies. Inside, the trial was every bit as chaotic. The courtroom buzzed with tension, the air thick with the weight of judgment. The prosecution wasted no time painting Mark as a man who had let his bigotry and pride curdle into violence. They called Sierra by her name, by her pronouns, humanizing her with photos of her smiling with friends, screenshots of text to her sister, even a video clip where she laughed about wanting to make enough money to leave Dallas and start fresh. This was not a crime of passion, the prosecutor thundered, pacing before the jury. This was a hate crime. A man sworn to protect the law murdered a young woman because she dared to exist in a way that challenged his prejudice. He didn't just kill Sierra, he silenced her. And now it is your duty to make sure she is heard. The defense countered with a very different narrative. Mark's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Wallace Greer, leaned into the language of shock, deception, and provocation. "My client is not a monster," Greer told the jury. He was deceived. He believed Sierra was someone she was not. And in a moment of intoxication, humiliation, and fear, he reacted. It was not premeditated. It was not a calculated act of hate. It was a tragic mistake, born in the heat of betrayal. He used phrases like panic response and temporary loss of control, terms designed to evoke sympathy. He leaned heavily on Mark's 15 years of decorated service, calling him a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others, who had walked into danger when others ran. But the evidence spoke louder than the rhetoric. The medical examiner testified that Sierra's bruises were consistent with manual strangulation, not an accident, not a scuffle gone wrong. Hotel staff described finding the room staged, pills scattered, whiskey bottles arranged, but with obvious signs of foul play. And then there was the footage, grainy but damning. The jury watched as a man of Mark's build, his gait, his very posture, slipped out of the hotel side door at 2:47 a.m. On the witness stand, Detective Alvarez was methodical, almost cold. "We treat every victim the same," she told the jury, her gaze unwavering. "But when I realized this suspect was one of our own, it was personal. Because when a cop kills, it kills trust. And that's something this city may never get back." The trial wasn't just about the facts anymore. It had become a referendum on identity, on masculinity, on what it meant to be deceived or to claim deception. Conservative pundits on television blasted Sierra, suggesting she had brought danger on herself. LGBTQ advocates pushed back, arguing that this line of thinking excused violence and put every transgender person at greater risk. The courtroom was merely the stage. The country itself was the audience, and it was deeply divided. Mark sat at the defense table each day, his face stone, though inside he was unraveling. He could feel the stares from the gallery, reporters scribbling notes, activists glaring, his former colleagues whispering about how far he had fallen. He thought about his son, now old enough to read the headlines. What would he think of his father? Would he ever look him in the eye again? When it was his turn to testify, Mark tried to summon the stoic authority that had once defined him. His voice wavered as he described the night. "I'd been drinking," he admitted. "Too much. I wasn't thinking straight. And then I found out. And I panicked. I felt betrayed, humiliated. I thought my life was over. My career, my reputation, my family, everything gone. I wasn't myself. I didn't mean to." His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. The defense hoped the display would sway the jury. But the prosecution hammered him in cross-examination. "You say you panicked," the prosecutor pressed. "But didn't you also stage the scene? Scatter pills, arrange bottles, wipe down the doorknob? That's not panic. That's calculation." Mark's silence in that moment spoke louder than any words could. By closing arguments, the courtroom was suffocating with tension. The prosecution urged the jury to see Sierra as a human being whose life was cut short not because of who she deceived, but because of who she was. The defense begged them to see Mark as a man, flawed and broken, who made one terrible mistake. When the jury left to deliberate, the city held its breath. News crews camped outside. Activists prepared statements for either outcome. Inside the holding room, Mark sat alone, his hands clasped so tightly they trembled. He thought of Sierra's last words, "You don't have to do this." And for the first time, he wondered if those words were meant not just to save her, but to save him too. Hours later, the jury filed back in, faces solemn. Everyone in the room rose as the foreman delivered the verdict. The courtroom was so silent you could hear the scrape of the foreman's chair as he stood. Every pair of eyes in the room locked on him, from the jurors sitting stone-faced in their box to the reporters clutching notepads in the gallery. Even Mark, who had spent the trial staring blankly at the table, lifted his gaze. In the case of the state of Texas versus Mark Reynolds, the foreman began, voice steady but heavy with weight, "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some cheered softly, hands clasped in relief. Others shook their heads, murmuring about injustice, betrayal, and what they called the criminalization of panic. Sierra's friends wept openly, clinging to each other. On the opposite side, a handful of Mark's former colleagues sat stiffly, their faces unreadable. Mark didn't move, his jaw locked, eyes fixed on the wood grain of the defense table. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the trial, imagined an acquittal, imagined walking free, even imagined some middle ground verdict that gave him hope of parole. But first-degree murder meant one thing: life without the possibility of release. The badge he once wore, the authority he once wielded, meant nothing now. Judge Thompson's voice broke the stillness. "Mark Reynolds, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. Given the severity of the crime and the circumstances of your position as a sworn officer of the law, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without parole." It was final. No deals, no second chances. The sound of the gavel echoed like a coffin, lid slamming shut. Mark's attorney placed a hand on his arm, murmuring about appeals, technicalities, anything to dull the sting. But Mark barely heard him. He was already being led away by deputies, shackles clinking as he shuffled toward the door. The reporters shouted his name, demanding a statement, but he didn't look back. In the weeks that followed, the case refused to fade. News outlets replayed the verdict on loop, analyzing every angle. Talk shows hosted heated debates. Was Mark a monster, or was he a man pushed past his breaking point? Pundits framed it as a battle between truth and deception, morality and prejudice. But for the LGBTQ community, it was never about theory. It was about survival. Sierra became a symbol. Another woman whose life had been stolen, another reminder of the violence transgender people faced simply for existing. Vigils lit up across Dallas, candles flickering against the summer night, her name spoken in chants and whispered prayers. At the police department, morale fractured. Some officers quietly defended Mark, muttering in locker rooms about being tricked. Others saw the case as a necessary reckoning, proof that wearing a badge didn't grant immunity from accountability. Detective Alvarez, who had testified so fiercely, became a reluctant face of reform, her words about trust replayed in national coverage. Inside prison walls, Mark Reynolds adjusted to his new reality. Gone was the authority, the respect. Inmates recognized him as the cop who killed a trans woman. For some, that made him a target. For others, oddly enough, it made him a kind of dark celebrity. But to Mark, it meant nothing. Days bled into nights, the clang of bars and the shuffle of feet marking time. The man who once carried himself with rigid pride now moved like a ghost through the corridors, hollow-eyed and silent. He wrote letters he never sent, to his son, to his ex-wife, even to Sierra's family. In them, he tried to explain himself, tried to piece together excuses and regrets. But each letter ended the same way, crumpled in his fist, tossed into the trash. No words could undo what he had done. For Sierra's family, the verdict brought a kind of closure, but not healing. Her sister, in a tearful statement outside the courthouse, said, "We can never get her back. But at least now the world knows her life mattered." Her words spread across social media, igniting conversations about dignity, justice, and a dangerous myth that deception justified violence. Months later, a mural appeared on the side of a building in Oak Lawn, the heart of Dallas's LGBTQ community. It showed Sierra smiling, her hair cascading over her shoulders, with the words, "She deserved to live." The mural became a gathering place, a site of memory and resilience. Meanwhile, Mark's name became shorthand for betrayal, an officer who embodied the very violence he had sworn to fight. Training programs in departments across the country began to use his case as a cautionary tale. Seminars on bias, identity, and crisis response cited him as an example of what happens when prejudice and power collide. In his cell, Mark sometimes thought back to that first night in the bar, to the moment he decided to make the call. He replayed it endlessly, wondering if he had known deep down, even then, that this path would end in ruin. He thought of Sierra's final words, "You don't have to do this," and realized too late that she had been right. He hadn't had to do it. He had chosen to, and that choice had destroyed them both. The story of Detective Mark Reynolds and Sierra lingered long after the trial closed. It became less about one man and one woman in a hotel room, and more about the fault lines in a society wrestling with identity, prejudice, and violence. Sierra's death and Mark's downfall stood as grim reminders that secrets do not kill people. Fear does. And in the end, it was fear of shame, fear of exposure, that turned a man with a badge into a murderer and a young woman searching for a better life into a martyr. This case wasn't just about a murder in a hotel room. It was about fear, power, and the cost of secrets. And it left America asking, how many more Sierras will there be before the violence ends?